Hi, everyone. If you're new here, welcome to the channel. I have a very special guest here with me today. Her name is Frankie Mesmer. She is an incredibly talented language learner and teacher, and every single day she gives people the confidence to integrate the English language into their daily lives. People working with Frankie tell me that she has a very unique conversational style when learning English with her, and they also mention how she is amazing and making the learning interesting and personal to them. So, Frankie, aside from that, is there anything that you want to mention to the audience about what you do?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Eric, for that amazing introduction. My name is Frankie, and I've been teaching English as a second language since 2018. And I really enjoy helping adult learners be able to develop their English so that they can study abroad, get better job opportunities, and just have better social interactions in their daily life.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you for that addition. So, in this particular video, we'll have a nice chat about common mistakes people in the tech field in particular make when interviewing, and what exactly can you do when interviewing to help in those tough situations. So, Frankie, I want to ask you, from the tech students that you work with, what's the biggest reason you see that they struggle in interviews?
Great question. So I would say tech professionals are probably one of the top professions that I work with in my students because a lot of them need English uh, to be able to learn about their careers, the software, and sometimes they're working on international teams and they need to have that strong English level, right? So when they go to apply for some of these jobs, there's often two parts to the interview. So one part is more the technical side. They need to show that they have the technical knowledge to do the job that is required of them. But there's also another side that is more communicative, and they have to prove their English level. And I think there's kind of two problems that can happen. And the first one might sound a little harsh, but it just might be that your English level is not enough yet. And so you're taking on a challenge that you're not ready for. And that's completely okay, right? We're not all born ready to speak a foreign language fluently. It takes effort and time to develop that skill. And I think the other challenge could be maybe your level is good enough, but you're letting the nerves and the pressure take advantage. It could also be things like perfectionism. You're so worried about making mistakes or finding the perfect word. It's stopping you from being able to perform at the level that you need to in that interview.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up some excellent points there. So one thing is that I'm really glad that, you give hope to people who, even if right now their English may not be at the level they want, that that's kind of a skill that they can work on and get better at. And it's something that, it may be difficult to do, but it's definitely possible to improve. And, that can be sort of a low-hanging fruit that people can do to improve in interviews. But also, like you mentioned, in technical interviewing for jobs, there's, the technical component, which it sounds like probably most of the clients you work with are largely pretty good at that piece. Um, and then there's the more communication piece, which even people with perfect English sometimes struggle with that. I know that when I entered the tech field, I was very all about like the coding and all those kind of skills, but it can be, a bit of a learning curve to learn the great communication styles that you need in an interview setting. So I'm sure that when you work with your clients, that's something that, they work with them on and something that can be improved a lot. So like, what are some specific things that you see that make people, maybe lose the offer or, fall out of the interview process? Like any patterns you see when working with people that cause that?
I also asked this question to some of my tech professional students today just to see their actual perspective, not just like how I'm reading the situation. And of course, I got some different answers. One of them mentioned that as tech professionals, oftentimes they might be more introverted. That might have been why they chose to go the tech route in the first place. They prefer, working on the computer compared to like working in a job that requires a lot of socializing, right? And so sometimes they have developed these technical skills very well, but the soft skill of speaking and communicating might need some more time and development. And like you said, that could even be for native speakers, right? Interviews are high pressure, and you might have like a good idea, but when it was time to answer it, like the words didn't hop into your brain. And I think when it's not your native language, that happens even more. You're like, I know these words, why can't I think of them right now? And so I think that's another element is a lot of tech professionals are very logical people. They can be quite perfectionists. And language isn't so logical or mathematical all the time. And it's really not about getting it perfect, right? It's about being authentically yourself and communicating a strong message during that interview. So I think perfectionism and maybe underdeveloped soft skills can be big challenges in interviews for tech people. I don't know. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, there are a couple of points that I thought of based on what you're saying. So one is just that, technical or non-technical interviews are just sort of a weird communication environment, right? So, there's sort of a built-in power dynamic oftentimes where, as the interviewee, you're kind of hoping you get the role and you feel like, maybe the company has more power, whereas in non-interview scenarios, maybe it's more collegial. And I think the other thing that you're touching upon is that I think a lot of, technical, logically minded people, they know that they have to work for years and hours and months, however long it takes to gain those technical skills, and that's sort of accepted. But I think when it comes to the communication piece, I mean, that really does need sort of a similar level of practice. It's a different skill than the technical skills, but I think a lot of people write it off as, I talk in my daily life, so I could talk in interviews, and that is definitely far from the truth, as I think you're alluding to. It's really great that, you get to see the communication side up close by talking, with people, whether native speakers or not, who can use a little boost in their skills in technical interviewing. And, the other thing I notice is, like many things that are important in life, interviewing is not really a skill that's like taught in school, kind of like
Mhm.
math and science. People are usually left to practice on their own, fail. And, when people have real interviews with companies, they often get generic feedback and they don't benefit from the sort of honest feedback conversation that they would get if they, collaborated with someone like you. So thank you for sharing those insights.
For sure, Eric, I agree. Within the school system, they don't really do a lot of interview training, just like communicative training, public speaking training, all of this. And they're very valuable skills for us to carry on when we go to university or into our careers. And I would really like to see those kind of skills more included in our education system. I also want to say I was speaking more from a stereotype. I think there are a lot of technical people that are very sociable, just like you, Eric. So I think every individual is going to have their own challenges. And I think there's also people that are extroverts that might be very comfortable socializing, but when they're in the interview, the stress and the pressure makes it hard for them to still be able to like organize their ideas in their head. So I think extroverts, introverts, we can still have big challenges in interviews. They just might look a little different.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, one thing we've kind of been alluding to here is, interviews just often feel very unnatural. Kind of like we were mentioning earlier, there's that built-in power imbalance. And also the nature of the questions asked, whether technical or not, they can seem kind of vague. Like, you would think a question like, tell me about yourself would be simple, but it can actually be like very nuanced and complicated to answer. Um, there might be like artificial time boxes to things that you might have more time to do in the real world. But, when you're talking with your students, do you see evidence of what pressure does to their delivery in the sense of like when they feel pressured to come up with an answer, like how does that affect how they communicate, and are there strategies they can use to sort of cope with that and improve?
Oh yeah, for sure. So it's not necessarily like a job interview, but with some students, I help them prepare for like a test interview. It's usually going to be about 10, 15 minutes. They're going to be asked certain questions, so the spotlight's on them and they really need to be able to answer all the questions that come their way. I think it's very similar to a job interview style. And these are things we're actively doing every week in class. And I can notice some behaviors. I think one of the biggest challenges is they get stuck. They're like trying to answer the question, but then they don't have the vocabulary word. Yeah. And a lot of students kind of freak out. So you could do the whole like fight or flight thing. Yeah. Do you fight the situation, try to communicate the best you can? Or do you flight and you fall back onto your native language or just say, "Ugh, I can't do it." Yeah. And I noticed the flight option is actually quite common. Now, obviously, in my classes, it's lower pressure. So if you flight there, there's not like a big consequence or something. But I do think it's important that I teach them to not flight in those situations. You don't need the perfect word. I think this becomes a big challenge because they're translating in their head and they want to use this like this perfect word that exists in their language and they just don't have it in English. And so what I really encourage people to do is try to communicate with the language you do have. Oftentimes there's a synonym. If you don't have the word, try to explain the concept. Usually you'll be surprised at how much you can still communicate even when you don't have that perfect word. There could be situations you don't, but don't stop, just take maybe a different direction, but don't give up on the question. I really encourage them to keep moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And, something I thought of while you were telling me this is that, I'm sure especially with people who have maybe not as much of a vocabulary in English, how important it is to, try your best to practice sort of common questions and, what phrases you do know how to answer them so that when you're in that interview setting, you don't maybe get taken aback and have to worry about like forgetting the right words. I'm sure there's still some curveballs in interview settings that, are hard to prepare for. But, I find in a lot of interviews, like, maybe as much as, 80 to 90% of the questions, are kind of the same sorts of questions. And, the other thing that, I wanted to get your view on, but also I think a lot of people, and I've been guilty of this, a lot of people, when they're asked a question in an interview, they think that like they need to answer right away and they can't take a moment to breathe and collect their thoughts. When the reality is, when you take that time and just kind of like, plan a little bit for a couple seconds what you'll say, that could make a difference. Is that something that, that comes across when you like talk with your clients? Is that something that helps them?
Yeah, that's a really big tip, Eric. And I think especially those that aren't native speakers will feel a lot of relief with that tip. You don't have to have like the answer right away. Take a moment, collect your thoughts and ideas. I think that that would help them develop a stronger answer. I think that's important even for us as tutors, right? especially with what I do. I'm asking them questions. We're trying to have conversations. You want that answer like right away. Um, but they might need a moment to think about it, really develop that answer. And it's important that they don't feel the pressure to answer right away. So I think that's a really important tip.
Yeah, and like honestly, no one will remember, those 2 seconds that you took to pause. What they will remember is whether what you said afterwards makes sense, right? And I think that, I think a lot of people maybe don't think about that. I certainly didn't when I started interviewing until I, sort of got feedback on my style a little bit.
Let me ask a question about that. So let's say you get thrown a question that caught you off guard, and you do want to take, maybe a couple seconds to collect your ideas. What phrase do you think they could say while they're trying to collect those thoughts?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you asked that. So, and I'm not successful at this every time, but when I get a curveball question that I just like really don't know or have to take a second, I say, that's a great question. Would you mind if I just, have a few moments to think about how I would answer that? Um, and most interviewers like are not only okay with that, but expect that because some questions in an interview are sort of designed to make you think. So, you should take a moment to think about it. That's, okay and expected. So, yeah, it could be as simple as, can I have a moment? And then, if even after those few moments you may still not know the answer, I think what interviewers want to see is like how you approach the problem. So you're like, okay, so I haven't seen this, but like maybe here's something similar that I know about and this is how I think it might work. Just, any effort, like you said, not to, flight away, don't give up. Just sort of try what you know to get the answer. So that certainly helps me. So, not sure if, other people might also think about that, but
Oh yeah, that's a good one, like think, that's a great question, or that's a good question. Let me think about it for a moment. Yeah, that's a good way to maybe not get the complete silence, but let them know that you're thinking about it for a moment. And I agree. It lets them know that you care about quality, you know, um, you're a thoughtful person, and they'll probably end up being more impressed with the answer if you take a moment to chew on it. That's the word I always like to use. Let me chew on that for a second.
yeah, exactly. And I think at the end of the day, what companies want to see when interviewing someone is what would it be like to work with this person? So, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to work with someone who just like jumps at the first answer they think of after 2 seconds, go with it, and don't take a moment to think about things. To me, I would want someone who, is kind of reasonably careful and, knows when they need to think. So that is, not only okay, but I think appreciated in interview settings as well. Yeah, did you have anything else you wanted to say, like about that particular point?
No, I think that covers it, but I think that is a great tip to allow yourself that pause, take a breath. I think it'll also help you with stress. Yeah. Because I've been in interviews. And in general, when I need to speak in front of people or the spotlight's on me, I'm getting better with it on the computer. But I get very nervous and shaky. I forget my thoughts. It's something I definitely need to practice more to control it. But I get very nervous in interviews myself, and I think that grace that it's okay to pause and breathe and recollect will help you be able to face that stress and pressure a lot more easily.
Right. And even also as someone who I've been the person interviewed, but I've also been like on interviewing committees, like talking with candidates. And, believe it or not, like if someone even takes a quick moment, they just briefly acknowledge, like they say, I'm a little nervous right now. If they just say it briefly, like, I appreciate that sometimes because they're honest and, they care about making a good impression. And I don't think people even have a problem with being that sort of direct, as long as you don't dwell on it and just make it a quick point.
I will add something there, Eric. We have two parts, right? The interviewer and the interviewee. And you have to remember, just like the interviewee might not always give the best answers, the interviewer might not always be asking the best questions either. Being a good interviewer is also a skill. And I think that can maybe also take a little pressure off your own shoulders, like both parties are having to perform well here, and they might throw a question at you that might not be very useful, but you still need to be able to try to give your best answer in those moments. Do you know of any like bad interviewer habits?
That's a phenomenal point. Like the interviewer is not perfect, and just like candidates, there are people who are more skilled at being an interviewer, and some who need to practice. One issue I commonly see is running into challenges with like questions that run into legal issues. So when you're the interviewer, there are certain kinds of questions that legally you can't ask, and that they could be questions that seem relatively simple, like you can't ask a candidate's age, you can't ask whether they have children in the interview. There are legal issues like that, and some interviewers, maybe aren't aware of those or don't remember in the moment, and try to dive into those topics, and then maybe run into challenges later. So that's one thing, but I think the more common issue is just a lack of preparation on the interviewer's part. Um, a lot of people conducting the interview, have their own jobs to do, and may or may not prioritize the hiring process as much as their other work. So maybe they come in with not as much preparation. But I find that when interviewers care, they're aware of the potential legal issues and they practice. I find that it's generally a good conversation, and you just need to treat candidates sort of like they're human, and but that's okay to sort of test their skills. I don't know if that helped answer your question, but
Oh, for
uh,
sure. I think another problem can be they're not making the interview very personable. It's very robotic, generic, but they're not really like helping the interviewee relax, feel like they can be themselves. Yeah, it just kind of feels like they're drilling questions at you. Yeah, and it really should feel more like a conversation. At least that's my opinion on interviews. And I think interviewers are much more successful in selecting the right candidate when they take the time to help that person relax and truly get to know them, instead of just making it too serious per se.
yeah, that totally happens. Especially that there are some interview rounds in tech that may be more trivia focused, but there's always an opportunity to make it more human and to be more personable. And like you said, you'll attract better candidates to your company if, you sort of have those skills, make them feel comfortable, and that's so important. And yeah, being an interviewer is, just as much of a skill as, having the technical skills for the role. So it's very, very important for sure.
Have you ever had a bad interview, Eric?
As the interviewer or the interviewee or
Interviewee as the interview.
oh yeah, plenty. My bad interviews probably far outnumber my good ones, especially when I was first trying to get roles in the tech field. I mean, you know, even if you have the best intentions, interviewing for, a tech role or any kind of role, it takes practice to get comfortable. Um, you know, the even if you read 1,000 books about interviewing, you really won't know what it's like until you're in the situation and you know how to navigate certain kinds of things. It does take persistence for sure. And it takes persistence, but also sort of the deliberate practice of, working with, whatever, someone like you or like a mock interviewing coach, like someone who can help. Because, it's never great to make the same mistakes, over and over, especially if you don't know what they are. Um, but yeah, I've certainly had my fair share of, failed interviews, whether was on the tech portion or, I didn't prepare enough, did my research enough on the company. And, these are some things you kind of learn as you go, but, there are ways to, prevent those issues for sure. But yeah, that's a great question. Um, you know, I'm not sure if you interviewed for jobs at any point and that's something you can relate to, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I
it's
mean, most of my job interviews have gone fairly well, but I did have one that was particularly really bad. Um, and I do think there's an element that I could have prepared better. I can take the responsibility. I also did not have a lot of experience with interviews, but I truly was interested in the position. I was taking it very seriously. I even flew from one city to another one for that interview. And when I got to the interview, the interviewer was just really rude to me, asking inappropriate questions, and just made me feel really uncomfortable. I was so happy to like leave the room. I actually cried. I did not
uh,
cry during the interview. I kept it together. But as soon as I was outside, I just broke down because like she really made me she just put me down, if that makes sense. And I also learned from that experience, though, one, I need to prepare better for interviews. Um, and number two, to never let someone like question my abilities or intelligence to truly be confident and what I have to offer to the company. Yeah.
yeah, and and I'm so sorry that happened. And I've definitely had moments where where especially during maybe a trivia round where they sort of allude to like, oh, you didn't know that, like, are you dumb or something like that. And yeah, and as an interviewer, of course you shouldn't put people down, but it also just like reflects poorly on your company, even if it's just one interviewer. So it's important to gain those skills and like first of all, just generally be kind and human to people, but also, practice like being a great interviewer and making people feel comfortable. And that's so important because, if not, you get experiences like the one that you unfortunately had. And I'm sure, others listening might have had experiences like it as well. So thank you for sharing that. So yeah, I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sure it's happened to, some other people listening. Um, so let's move on to like talking a little more deeply about, what is it that interviewers are actually evaluating? Because I think a lot of people go into an interview and, maybe they get some feedback from the company, you weren't the right candidate or something generic that they can't really act on. So they might make the same mistakes over and over again, um, and, not know what they're doing wrong. So, yeah, so a technical interview is not just about like whether the final answer is correct, but it's also about whether you can explain your thinking process. So do you have any like strategies for people you work with um, to help make their answer sound like confident when they're speaking in English? Um, to sort of like sound the way they want to in an interview?
I think it's important when we go into an interview to remember that the interviewer is probably looking for two main things. Yeah. And one of them is, what can you do for my company? Yes. What do you have to offer? Yeah. And number two is, what kind of person are you to work with? And so to really keep those two things in mind in whatever you answer. You might be able to talk a little bit about like your hobbies or family, but I wouldn't dwell on those things very much. Really keep in mind, what do I have to offer? And, what is it like working with me? Really keep those things in mind. And then in terms of confidence, going back to what we were saying earlier, a lot of people can be perfectionists. We're looking for the perfect words or answers. There are no perfect words or answers. What really matters is you. showing who you authentically are. Sometimes we want to use like fancy words, but in reality, most people don't use a lot of fancy words in their everyday life. The basic responses that you have are actually going to help you be more confident because it's naturally how you would respond to that question. So don't worry about trying to sound like the most intelligent person in the room. Just give your best answer.
Yeah, so definitely, because I did mention earlier that I've been an interviewer as well. I think one thing that people who, are a candidate commonly do, like a mistake they make is when people say something like tell me about yourself. They try to tell, the entire life story of their career from like when they started as an intern, like all the way to now. And, it's good experience, but like you said, what the company is interested in is like, what can you do for me and what can you do for me like now or in the short term? So a lot of that life story sort of like isn't relevant for them. So one thing I tell people to focus on is like what specifically about your experience in like a minute or less can you, communicate to the company that, like you said, you can help the company succeed because that's really what they're looking for. And in addition to that, when you were saying that, you don't need to sound like the most intelligent person in the room, that's so true because maybe sometimes you're talking with a technical person in an interview, but a lot of the first rounds are with, a recruiter, someone from HR, or someone else non-technical. So you have to be able to communicate your ideas in a way that people, whether technical or not, will be able to understand what you're saying. So conveying the impact you can make to the company is so important. And like you said, talking about your hobbies, don't dwell on it, but throwing something in there could make you sound more human. I don't think it's something you necessarily like would have to throw in there, but if you, feel like it relates to the conversation, like maybe something you have in common with the interviewer, then why not mention it? It keeps it a little human, right?
And
Yeah.
to add to that, if we are mentioning like hobbies, like I said, part of it is showing them the type of person you are to work with. And that is who you are in and out of work, right? So, if you're someone who exercises regularly, it shows them that you're someone that's hardworking, you have dedication. And so there are ways that can show your skills through telling those parts of your life. Maybe you're someone that's dedicated to professional development, right? So you study English in your free time. Yeah, you read books. All of these things can also show like who you are as a person in an authentic way. And it can really help you with confidence so much. Another really good tip with the tell me about yourself question is I do believe storytelling is probably one of the best ways to answer this question. But you're right. Don't tell your whole life story. When you start to give long-winded answers, you actually start to lose the interviewer. They might get a little bored. So it is more important to probably keep it to about 1 to 3 minutes and really focus on what's helpful for them. And a good way to do that is actually to start with your present, like, what are you doing now? And then you can move on to your past and just mention what connects to it. And then finally, the future. What goals do you have? How are you going to help this company? This is called the present, past, future method. And it's a really good way to use storytelling to answer the tell me about yourself question.
Yeah, and I'm actually, I was going to ask you about if you had any frameworks, but that's a great one because, talking about, what you've done in the past is valuable to them because, they want to know that you have the experience. And again, keeping it, relevant to what the company wants, in the present and the future, because, most companies, they want someone, who at least might stay for a long time who can grow in that position, can contribute over time. So talking about the future is definitely valuable, especially if it relates to the current role or is it in a path that logically relates to the current role. So those are great tips for sure. And I think one mistake people make with the future parts sometimes that I hear is, they're asked like, what do you want to do in the next 5 years or some variation of that question, and they say, something that has like nothing to do with the role that they're interviewing for. So then the interviewers are like, well, do they really want this role if they want to be this like other thing in 5 years? But yeah, as long as you keep the future sort of related to the role, you keep the past, your past experience related to the role and the impact you can make, then I think that's a golden way to sort of meet your framework. So yeah, did you have any
Oh,
other thoughts on that?
oh, for sure. Like with that future, you're showing how this opportunity is going to contribute to that future goal. And that's the like perfect way to show them like why you're there interviewing today and how you plan to help them and how that company will also help you. Because it's important for us to remember, just as much as they're interviewing us, we're also interviewing them to see if it's the right fit for our career. And so when those two things match up, that's where the magic happens.
One of people's most favorite things to talk about is small talk. Some people really, really love it. Some people really, really hate it. But I think it's valuable to have a conversation about why it exists and what makes people trip up on it. Um, so, I guess like a couple of my quick thoughts is, small talk at the start of an interview, it may seem random to a lot of people, but it's actually not random at all. It is sort of something that's being evaluated, how personable you are. Um, like you want to work with someone who, can at least have like a good casual conversation. So like Frankie, in your opinion, why do you think small talk like happens in interviews and like what is it actually testing?
So, and before we get right into the interviews, I have had people tell me they hate small talk, especially from other cultures, Eric. They're like it's pointless. Um, but they've actually done psychological studies on it, and people that engage in small talk are often happier than those that don't. So small talk is just so important for like human interaction and connection. And I really think that's the whole purpose of it in the interview. And this is going back to like what makes a good interviewer. I think it is someone that is going to start with small talk. I understand, you might be short on time and you just need to get it done. It doesn't have to be like super long, but I think taking 2 to 3 minutes to have that casual conversation to help the interviewee relax a little bit, get to see who they are authentically. There's really a lot for the interviewer to evaluate in that moment. And I think this is the most important thing, and it's just how sociable is that person? As someone that pretty much engages in small talk every day for hours as a job, that I do see people who are generally interested in my life and having a conversation with me, and those that are there much more passively and they're not really taking any initiative there in the conversation. And so if you're someone that is genuinely interested in being there, getting to know the interviewer, letting the interviewer know who you are, they're going to be able to develop a better understanding of the type of person you are to work with. And I think that's the main purpose of small talk at the beginning of an interview.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I mean, I didn't even think about the point of it conveys that you're someone who takes initiative and wants to know about people. That's a really great point. But especially, I know we were talking about earlier in this conversation how, part of the job of an interviewer is to sort of help the candidate feel comfortable. And small talk, I think, is one of the, if not the best ways to do that. Just some quick conversations that reminds everybody that they're human, they do care about each other. And if you do work at the same company together, you want to, to some extent, like enjoy being around each other. So I think small talk is very important to bridge that gap. So let's get practical for a second. So like let's say somebody's engaging in small talk as during their interview. Like, do you have any tips for them, like how to navigate that? Um, like go-to things to say, like to sound natural. You know.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I think it is important to remember why we are there, which is for the job. So if you see opportunities where you can connect maybe some of your interests or hobbies that relate to the position, naturally, of course, I do think on authenticity is important. But like I was mentioning, like you're someone that likes going to the gym, you like reading books. What are you studying? Activities that show you're not someone who just parties on the weekend. Someone that really takes their personal and professional development serious. I think those are really helpful things to mention during that small talk. And I'm curious, Eric, as someone who does interviews, what do you engage in small talk at the beginning of the interviews?
Yeah, I do. And I especially appreciate it as, I find that when I was interviewing for maybe more entry level roles, it was, very focused on the technical skills. And, I still valued small talk, but I think that, companies were maybe a little more forgiving, like if you didn't have those skills or exercise those skills for small talk because an entry level role, is maybe more focused just on the hard work. um, but as I've interviewed for more senior level roles, it gets like really important to, have those social skills, being able to make people feel comfortable. Like if you want to be a manager or you want to lead a division of people, like you better know like how to make them feel comfortable. I mean, you also need to produce results, but a core part of a job like that is to, be able to influence people and socialize with them and, develop relationships like between departments. So, I absolutely do it when I'm the interviewer, and I try to do it as the interviewee as well. I think it's very important, even if it doesn't have to last for a very long time during the discussion, just, something small to make people comfortable, even if it's something as quick as, how was your weekend? Or like, just something small that's safe and anybody can answer, or like something you have in common. So that's what I find works for me. um
Yeah, that Eric, that kind of was where I wanted to go with this because unfortunately a lot of my interviews they didn't do a lot of small talk. They kind of like dove right into the interview questions. And so I was curious, like, since you do interviewing, what type of small talk questions you ask the interviewee? And you said one like, "How
yeah.
was your weekend?" What are some other common ones you've used?
Yeah, I mean, so if I don't know the person at all, sometimes I just like throw something quick out there to like maybe find something in common. Like, for example, if they're interviewing for a certain type of role, I might mention like a quick news story about something related, like, oh, did you see like this thing in the news about this? And if not, it's fine. It's just to start a conversation. But just anything that can sort of, get some commonality going, get them comfortable. It kind of depends on the situation a little bit, but I find that even that effort tends to make a positive impression. So just kind of like trying to get their perspective. And then, you were saying as the interviewee, like sometimes it's tough because when they're asking you the question, sometimes they jump right in. What I try to do in those situations is, I try to focus on answering the questions, but, if there is a spare moment, I try to like maybe throw in something light to, make it sound more human if I can. And that skill takes practice, but and I know it can be challenging, but that's what I do in those situations. So
Do do you ever use humor?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a comedian, but well, when it makes sense to, I maybe throw in a small joke. It really depends on the situation. And, another skill is both as an interviewer and an interviewee is kind of being able to read the room and see, how the person's feeling. Like some people are, more serious and about business, and in that case, I kind of focus on, kind of like answering properly and conveying my professionalism. Some interviewers are more laid back and you still want to try to do all the questions, but you can maybe be more like sociable. Sometimes that's to evolve based on like what kind of situation you're in, I think. So
Ooh, that's a good tip, like being able to read the room. That is a soft skill that we have to develop, especially for interviews.
yeah, and then I guess sort of like the last question from my end I had for you about this topic was, are there like very specific mistakes that you see people make, like who maybe aren't native English speakers, that you can sort of like anticipate and have ways to like resolve those issues?
Yeah, so again here, I would say there's probably like two ends of the spectrum if we're talking about extremes. And one of them is because they're nervous. Um, they give like really short answers, very generic answers, and they're not so helpful, so that the interviewer can get to know who you are. They're like so worried about not making mistakes that they just prefer to keep it very simple. Yeah. And then there's the other extreme where maybe someone has quite an advanced English level, but they want to show it off. And so they start to use like a lot of idioms and big fancy words, which is impressive, but it doesn't sound very natural. Yeah. And so I think it's important to stay maybe somewhere in between, like give details, use natural vocabulary, but also don't overshare. Yeah, like we were mentioning earlier, it's okay to mention a little bit about your hobbies and family, but don't give them your whole life story about that. Also, stay positive. You definitely don't want to be complaining in an interview. That'll get you points taken off real quick if you're complaining. What do you
Yeah.
think, Eric?
Um, yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think a lot of kind of like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I think a lot of people, maybe don't think that the small talk portion is as important as it actually is. Like, maybe they think that because I talk to people every day, this isn't really a skill I need. Or I encounter a lot of people who, maybe they think it's more interesting to kind of like get deep early, but in an interview setting, that's not necessarily the best thing to do. I think it's better to keep it light and, maybe something, small and safe that you have in common with somebody. Um, but yeah, those are the things that I see. So, did you have any sort of like closing thoughts you wanted to share about this topic or any others before we sort of like, close out the discussion?
My closing thoughts would be, okay, and this is specifically for non-native speakers that are having interviews. Um, you don't have to say every word perfectly. You will make mistakes. Even native speakers, we make mistakes. And remembering that when you go into the interview is really going to help you take that pressure off a little bit. Just like Eric said, remember it's okay to pause, breathe, but also preparing for the interview is very important. Even in your native language, we have to prepare for the interview, have good answers for that specific role that we're applying for. So really taking the time to develop the language you need to answer these interview questions will really help you. I'd recommend using AI or different like blogs on the internet, find the most common interview questions and write out your answers. Then practice saying them out loud. And this will really help you. not freeze up when you don't have those vocabulary words because you put in the work to develop your answers. But you can do it. Um, I really encourage you. And if you fail one time, learn from it and try again. You can even take on interviews like practice and training. You know, you'll get better and better with each one. But yeah, those are my final words, Eric.
Those are brilliant insights. So, if you want to find Frankie, probably the best place to go is her website, peachteachenglish.com. And I'll include some other means to connect with Frankie in the description. Thank you so much for coming on, Frankie. It was a pleasure having this discussion with you, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bye, guys.